Greetings. I think that one of the things that's really left unsaid is that we don't know our history. And even if we think we do know our history, it's often a very distorted and very bizarre narrative that has very little to do with the women's movement. We are all sitting on top of the shoulders of the women who created the modern women's movement. Not that there wasn't a movement before then, because women have been complaining ever since history was written. But the suffragists in the United States, they took 72 years just to get the vote. So if it's only been 40 years since the modern women's movement began, and we haven't gotten everything we want, not nearly, let me tell you about how it started, what was some of the accomplishments, and what is left to be done, and what were some of its failures. I think we need to have an accurate picture. So why did the women's movement begin in the early 60s? Well, one thing that we don't often hear in our classes is that there were three constituencies that were ripe for a women's movement. In other words, they had so many grievances, they absolutely would be listening, thinking, oh, a lot of aha, oh, that's my life. Here are the three constituencies. One were women who were already in the workforce. And despite the myths of the 1950s that women weren't in the workforce, there's a straight line of women who went into labor, into working in offices, especially corporations, as secretarial, clerical work. And those women were discriminated against, they were laid off, they were the first person to be laid off, and they were the last person to be hired. And most women of color were working. So we are only talking about white middle class and upper class women in the 50s who weren't working. So the women who were working discovered that they were the victim of various sexual predatory practices on the part of their boss, that they had very little money, they didn't make what men made for the exact same job. That's one constituency. Another constituency were those middle class women who were at home and feeling crazy, feeling absolutely out of their mind. Betty Friedan captured that madness very well. Those women were educated, some of them, and felt like they should be doing something with their lives, but they were living exclusively through the lives of their husband and their children. And if they were in the suburbs, they were very isolated, and it was not unusual for people to feel like they were going crazy. And this happened, and the Feminine Mystique, which appeared in 1963, responded to those women. Then there's the younger women, me. I was very young, and I was in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, and we were used to questioning authority. If there was no racial superiority, why should there be any sexual superiority? If the government lied during Vietnam, why should we believe anything the government told us? So we were among the young women who said, wait a minute, this has got to stop. We're in all these egalitarian movements, and what happens? The men tell us to make the coffee, they tell us we can't speak to the press because we're women, we're not authoritative enough. And so you have three constituencies: housewives, working women, and then young women who are part of the movements for social justice in the 1960s. Let me give you, for those of you who are really young, just an image of how bizarre life was before the women's movement. Some of these things will shock you. During the 1950s, the president of Harvard University saw no reason to increase the number of women. Why? Because the university's mission was to train the country's leaders. Harvard's Lamont Library was off. You could not go into it if you were a woman because you might distract these new male leaders in the 1960s. Newspaper ads were completely segregated. Women here, men here. So if you were a man, you wanted to become a nurse, too bad. If you're a woman and you wanted to become something else that was listed under men, like plumber, forget it. You couldn't get an apprenticeship. So that was one of the first things that the women's movement took on, classified ads. Bars refused women routinely. Banks refused to give women credit or loans. Your husband or your father had to sign for loans. I actually bought a house when I became a young assistant professor, the very year that finally loans were legally allowed to women. Radio producers said, oh, women cannot be on the radio because their voices are too abrasive. And TV executives said, women do not have the authoritative voice. Tell that to Gwen Ifill from NPR News, to be able to anchor news. So no women anchored any news. No women were on the Supreme Court. No women climbed electrical poles and fixed things. No women headed corporations. And if you can believe this, as late as 1970, a very famous doctor got on television and said, women are too hormonally disturbed to become the president. That caused quite a commotion. Few women knew any female professors, lawyers, or doctors. Everybody addressed a woman as Miss or Mrs., depending on your marital status, which was the essential thing. By 1972, the whole country called all women Ms. And why did the business community respond? Because it was so much easier to just write Ms. in front of every female name. They didn't have to figure out whether you were married or not. So business actually really is responsible for that. Abortion was illegal, and if a woman wanted an abortion, she had to go to some quack somewhere or another country and risk her life. Rape victims, it was assumed that rape victims had asked for it, and many women felt much too ashamed to report it. And there was no language, and this is my really takeaway point today. There was no language to describe many of women's experiences. The term sexual harassment didn't exist. There was no such thing as date rape. There was no such thing as marital rape. There's only two words that summed up life before the women's movement, and that is, that's life. That's just the way it was. It was the norm, and you didn't question it. Only women in college, for example, had curfews. Men did not. But the story gets more bizarre. Here's where it really starts. You wouldn't think that John F. Kennedy wanted to start a women's movement, would you? No. But he accidentally did. Unintended consequences of male behavior. He wanted to thank women for helping him to get elected. So he created a commission on women, on the status of women. Well, you know what happens when you bring a whole group of high-powered women together. They're all going to talk about the ways in which their lives are. They have grievances, many grievances. Well, though that national commission, which was headed by Eleanor Roosevelt, then created state commissions all over the country. Those in turn spawned city commissions. When all these commissions had collected all this data by 1963, it was a gross picture of how women were treated in this country. At the same moment, another unintended consequence. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was introduced in Congress to try to get rid of legal segregation. So the Southern stone racists said, let's include women in it, and then the northern people won't vote for it. The irony was they put in women and everybody voted for it. And it is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is the legal basis for almost all the legal suits that we today have created with class action suits, and it wasn't intended that. It was intended to be only a racial issue, but it became a gender issue. So what happened is a lot of the problems that women were having, they took to this new agency that was created by the Civil Rights Act, and the men laughed at them. They said, you're a joke. What we care about is people of color. We don't care about you. We don't want women, whatever color you are. And that is where NOW was created. They thought, I'm not going to be treated as a joke, and those women created NOW. Now, there was something else. Meanwhile, younger women who were really irritated by the way they were being treated by their supposedly equal men in their movements, they started creating consciousness-raising groups. Again, you put in a room a lot of women, and they will start talking about, like, is there an 11th commandment that only women can clean a toilet bowl? Or they'll start asking, like, why is it that, and why is it? I remember I was a graduate student in Berkeley, and I saw a little sign, 3x5 card, said, women's group forming. And I thought, well, I don't need that. I'm a graduate student. No one's been discriminating toward me. I had such false consciousness, it's unbelievable. I walked into this room, and I was a journalist, and I said, I would like to listen to you. And they said, well, you can if you participate. So I did. And they went around the room, and suddenly my world just went upside down. People said, just answer the question. If you were born a son or a boy, how would your life have been different? What decisions would you have made differently? Or what decisions would have been made for you differently? And I thought about, why did my brother get to play with trains, but I didn't? How come I didn't get to play with his BB gun when I was a better aim? How come I stopped playing the snare drums in elementary school, although I loved the drums, but I was teased out of it by the boys? This went on. And in these consciousness-raising groups, many issues were redefined. Some of those things that were redefined were crimes. And I really mean this seriously. There were certain customs that were completely redefined as crimes. For example, wife beating, which all over the world has been seen as a custom, became an assault, a felonious assault, and battered women's shelters were created, and women were not allowed to be beaten. And the police no longer saw it as a private matter, but rather something that society was responsible for. A second thing that was really important for anyone who has worked anywhere is sexual harassment. We didn't have that language. Then someone in the 70s, it was like a gigantic excavation of language. Someone wrote a book about sexual harassment, and we began to think, oh, so that's what it is when someone asks for sexual favors or fires you if you don't comply. And that, by the end of the 70s, became illegal. Or, for example, we all knew about rape that happened on campus, but we didn't ever think about the words date rape, that in fact, when a woman says no, it still matters, no matter what the point is when she says no. Then there was marital rape. Who had ever heard of such a thing? In fact, there was a very famous California state senator who said, if I can't rape my wife, then who can I rape? That got people very annoyed. Very, 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 very annoyed. By the 1980s, the backlash against the women's movement really started in great ferocity. The Republican Party changed its entire platform, which had been pro-choice, had been advocates of women. They changed their entire platform, and it became sort of the daddy party. It was called that. The Democratic Party became the mommy party. And so women's issues became attached to the Democratic Party, and anti-women's issues became identified with the Republican Party. A lot of things happened in the 80s to make young women think, I don't want to have anything to do with this. First of all, there was the word feminism to begin with. The beginning of the women's movement, no one called themselves a feminist. Only around 1970 and 72 did people start using the word feminist. They just called themselves women's rights activists. So what happens in the 80s is you start getting kind of myths. One myth is that everyone who's in the women's movement is white and middle class. Wrong. All the leaders, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, all the women in the young movement were the first in their family to go to college. But you know what happens when you go through college? 4 years later, you come out looking middle class, more poised, able to speak, literate, hopefully, and articulate. And so you look white middle class, or you look like you're African American middle class. But the truth is, all those leaders were not. None of them were. A second myth was that the women's movement had said, be a superwoman, you can have it all as long as you do it all. I swear to you, as a historian, I have looked through everything that was ever written. Nobody in the women's movement ever said that. That was popularized by magazines and by a few journalists who wrote books called Having It All. We never thought you could have it all. Never. What we assumed was that you could have it all if a man also took care of the house, the children, if the government had subsidies for childcare, and only if there was a real egalitarian life in the family could women possibly have it all and do it all. It was too much to assume you could work and take care of a family. And of course, the New York Times sort of knows that because once a year they publish some article on how you should just juggle and juggle and juggle, and somehow maybe you'll have it all and do it all. And it's crazy. That's not what people wanted. So where are we now? Well, the positive thing is that we have redefined some customs as crimes. There are many different feminisms. Every minority group in America created some feminist group even before 1970. We named injuries of women's lives, and that's important. And we can call ourselves girls now, which we didn't want to be called in 1960, because we don't see it as diminutive anymore. We feel like we're more in charge now. We can say, hey, girls, let's do something. Being called a girl and a chick in 1960 meant you were really an unimportant person. But what is left to be done? The most important thing that has not been done and has not been on the national political agenda is childcare. Everybody knows. In 1970, 50,000 women marched down Fifth Avenue with 3 demands. One was legal abortion, which is kind of iffy in this country. Some places, yes, some places not so easy. Equal pay for equal work. Now we get 78% instead of 59% when the women's movement began. Changed a bit, 30 cents. And the most important thing was childcare. Those were the 3 demands. Childcare has never become part of a congressional legislation. Not since 1971, when Richard Nixon, as president, vetoed it. And why did he veto it, you might ask? Because Congress and the Senate passed a comprehensive child care act that would have given child care subsidies and community child care for all working people, and also would subsidize childcare at the work site. Why? Because he said he didn't think that women in America should be like Soviet women, and they should be home getting beautiful for when their husbands came home. So we do have a huge care crisis. We have a care crisis of women being 80% of the population taking care of children and elderly parents. And what does that do? It makes women feel alone and as failures. And what are women told? For 30 years, the women's magazines have transformed the women's movement from a collective pressure group into an individual problem. If you just get the right clothes, if you just go to the right shrink and you get your head on straight, if you just do this, if you just do that, but what about other people? The fact is you don't get legislation, laws, and executive orders changed unless there is a pressure and there's a collective movement. If you do it individually, a few people will break the glass ceiling, but most women will stay on what I call the sticky floor. And people have to act together. One thing that I want to just end with is something that the great poet Muriel Rukeyser wrote. She said, as women share their secrets, and that's one thing we can do today, women learn to see the world through their own eyes and discover, much to their surprise, that they are not the first and they are definitely not alone. She said, what would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? Her answer, the world would split open, and so it has. A revolution is underway, and its end is in sight. Thanks very much.